couple of weeks ago, producer Shel Talmy died at the age of 87. Talmy was born in Chicago, but he moved to Britain in the mid-60s and worked with some big names from that period such as the Kinks and the Who. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of his best and most iconic productions. Let's begin. This single by the Kinks is without a doubt one of the most iconic singles Shel Talmy ever produced. The single was released in August 1964, and it became the first chart topper for both the Kinks and the producer. Dave Davies' distorted guitar tone has been cited as the blueprint for both punk rock and heavy metal. Shel Talmy recalled,
"My first session with the Kinks was scheduled for January 1964, and we discovered that Pi insisted we record their choices, 4 songs that consisted of Long Tall Sally by Little Richard, and 3 of Ray's early efforts that he and I didn't want to record, but were forced into it.
Just as both the Kinks and the producer predicted, the record-buying public wasn't interested.
The next song he wrote was You Really Got Me, which we all felt was a hit, and to make our point, a meet was arranged at Pi's offices. We said that we were unhappy with the tracks we had been commanded to record, and for the next single we insisted on recording that new song that Ray had just written.
At the time, Pi Records was lagging behind the other major labels, and they were desperate to find a band that could score hits in the charts. So the record label finally agreed to what the Kinks wanted to record.
The session was held in June at Pi's studio number 2, and the track turned out great, and Pi loved it. But after listening to it for a couple of days, Ray decided that his song was too slow and bluesy and wanted to re-record it. Pi Records refused to fund another session, so I said I would pay for it, and booked a session at IBC Studios. So around the second week of July, we re-recorded the song.
You really got me, you really got me, you really got me. Most of Shel Talmy's productions from the 60s had a very distinctive and recognizable drum sound. Talmy recalled,
"As I had done on the band's earlier recordings, I was very pleased to be able to book Bobby Graham, the #1 rock session drummer in the UK. The Kinks drummer Mick, however, played tambourine on the recording. I also booked Perry Ford, who was a good piano player and part of the Ivy League trio. I mic'd Bobby Graham's drums with my usual dozen mics, and Perry Ford's piano had a mic each on the bass and treble strings that were mixed together. Pete Quaife was a terrific bass player, so no problem there. And to confirm the question I've answered so many times over the years, yes, Dave Davies played the solo. Jimmy Page was one of my favorite guitarists, and I employed him on many productions. I employed him to play on the session as well, but strictly only as a rhythm guitarist. This was because Ray Davies, who normally played rhythm, wanted to concentrate on his singing.
You really got me going. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing.
All those iconic guitar parts you hear on the song are solely and exclusively the work of Dave Davies, who is one of the most underrated rock guitarists in the music biz. Dave was playing a Harmony Meteor guitar plugged into an El Pico amp, which we usually referred to as the Little Green Monster. Dave had sliced into the amps cone to get the growlet produced, and that amp was hooked up to a Vox AC30 amp. I mic'd both amps and combined their individual sound output into what you hear on the record. Backing vocals were double-tracked and done by Dave, Pete Quaife, and Ray's wife, Rasa Davies.
Oh yeah, you really got me now. You got me so I got you right. You really got me. You really got me.
We were recording on 3-track, and I used a German manufactured tape called AGFA, which turned out to be a brilliant decision because years later, when this tape was played, it sounded like it had been done that day. We had the master done in 2 takes, and the single was released a couple of weeks later.
The single became a massive hit, reaching #1 in both the UK and in the States. My Generation by The Who is another Tell Me production which has become a classic, and it's still remembered as one of the definitive youth anthems of the 60s. Shel Talmy recalled,
When I was producing The Who in the 60s, the state-of-the-art tape machine was only 3 tracks of sound. The significance of that limited number of tracks was that decisions about what was being recorded needed to be made in real time. Instruments had to be tuned, not in the musical sense, but by adding or taking away high or low frequencies to arrive at the sound you wanted to hear. And if echo was required for the vocalist or individual instruments, it had to be added during recording, as it couldn't be added later on. And of course, it was necessary to envision how the tracks were mixed together for the final release.
The song was recorded at IBC Studios in October 1965, with Glyn Johns as the sound engineer.
Before the session, I spent some hours with Pete Townsend at IBC, working out the miking of how best to capture Pete's guitar feedback and overtones, and we wound up with the following technique. One microphone a few inches from the amp, a second one about 6 feet away from the amp, and a third across the studio room so it would pick up the overtones bouncing around the walls. During the session, I mixed the sounds from the 3 mics to a single track. I used 12 mics on Keith Moon's drum kit, and he was enclosed by thick soundproof panels that prevented leakage from his drums into other parts of the studio. John Entwistle's bass and Pete Townsend's guitar amps were enclosed in smaller baffles, and Roger Daltrey was singing in a sound booth. John Entwistle performed probably the most iconic bass solo ever heard on a rock record. My Generation was done in 3 takes, meaning that 3rd take we decided to use for the released record couldn't get any better. And keeping in mind this was 1965, the invoice for the session reveals that the whole thing cost 88 UK pounds to record, approximately 245 American dollars.
The single reached number 2 in Britain, and it became a top 10 hit in several European countries and in Australia. In the States, where the band was still virtually unknown at the time, the single only managed to reach number 72.
Anyway, the fun 50, these are the creations. 8 minutes past 8.
Unfortunately, the Creation never managed to reach the success of many of their contemporaries. But many of the group's singles have become major cult favorites among fans of British music from that period. Shel Talmy recalled,
The Creation was as much of a pleasure to record as producing the Kinks and the Who. They were one of my favorite bands to work with, and I think they could have reached the same rarefied heights as the Who or the Stones. But they didn't because of my and everyone else's inability to keep them from breaking up.
The group was formed in the early 60s as the Mark IV, and the band featured bassist John Dalton, who joined the Kinks later in 1969. Between 1964 and 1966, the group released 4 singles which went pretty much unnoticed. After a few lineup changes, the Mark IV changed their name to The Creation.
Then I met Tony Stratton Smith, who everyone knew as Strat. Strat was a sports writer and a good friend who had written a novel for my book publishing company, and who later started the very successful Charisma record label. Strat fed the music press with the story that was the beginning of a publicity campaign that presented The Creation as an original act whose music and outspoken personalities were forces to be reckoned with. And he was right on both accounts. They were all very smart, articulate, and had what the television industry calls TVQ, audience appeal. Strat brought me the band to meet and listen to, and I was in instant rapport with them. I signed them to my new label, Planet Records, and started planning recording sessions. For the first session, we chose Making Time, the song that Kenny and Eddie co-wrote, which I thought was a hit the first time I heard it. I loved the track because it was loud, ballsy, melodic, and had a secret weapon that was brand new and original. Eddie played the guitar with a violin bow. we went to IBC Studio to record the track. IBC still used 3-track tape machines, meaning I had to bounce from 3-track to 3-track to add all the additional parts for making time. On the first 3-track tape, we used one channel for Bob Garner's bass and Jack Jones's drums, which were mic'd with a dozen microphones. The second channel was for Eddie's guitar, with one mic on the amp, one near the string so I could pick up some of that noise, and a third mic about 6 feet away from the amp. Track 3 was for Eddie's violin bow in the solo section. The 3-track to 3-track additions included Kenny Pickett's lead vocal, mic'd with a Neumann 87.
Making time, shooting lines.
And I then double-tracked Kenny, added the background vocals, and also tambourine.
Why do we have to carry on? Always singing the same old song, same old song, the same old song.
The single was released in June 1966, but unfortunately, it only managed to reach number 49.
We were convinced Making Time was going to be a huge hit, but Philips Records, which was my distributor, did absolutely nothing to promote the record, even though they had promised to do the opposite. This was the main reason why I folded Planet Records in such a short time.
Monday morning feels so bad.
The Easy Beats hailed from Australia, where they had already scored several major hits in 1965. The group moved to the UK in July 1966, and this was the first single they recorded in Britain.
We fell into a routine where they'd come up to the office once a week and play me what they'd written. This went on for about 6 weeks, until the day they played me Friday on My Mind. I instantly knew that we had found a hit, so I booked studio time at IBC Studios. I did the engineering with John Pantry as my assistant, and as the group was very well rehearsed, we got the master on the third take. Then, Steve Wright added his lead vocal, while Harry Vanda and George Young did the backing vocals. United Artists loved it, and the record went on to become the international smash that we all hoped it would.
The single became a worldwide hit. It reached number 6 in the UK, number 16 in the States, and it became a top 10 hit in several European countries and number 1 in Australia. A couple of weeks after the song became a hit, Shel Talmy was asked to have a meeting with producer Ted Albert, who had produced all the previous singles by the group.
Ted Albert informed me that now that the Easy Beats were international stars, the contract I signed in good faith with Mike Vaughn was nonsense, and that he'd consider paying me maybe only a third of the royalties I was due. I responded that such an idea was unacceptable, but I was in London while he and expensive lawyers were many thousands of miles away in Australia. So initiating a lawsuit at that distance would be frustrating and expensive. The bottom line is, Ted Albert conveniently forgot about the reduced royalties he might be willing to pay, and to date, I haven't received one penny for my work with the Easy Beats.